have a number of photographs of her, some not so flattering as was common in those days, but this is the one that I really like. First, this woman lived most of her life with a condition which these days probably would be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder, and it was severe. There was a period of 14 years where she was unable to leave her house. She was barely able to get out of bed and get into a chair. The depression was deep and disabling. Sadness, the reliving of the traumatic event that caused all of this, and the physical symptoms, the pain and fatigue that often go along with extreme cases of post-traumatic stress syndrome. That's what this woman lived with. And yet, here she is in this photograph, and she appears to, on that day, at that time, to have pulled it all together. She looks alert, engaged. She is dressed in a way you'd expect somebody to be dressed at that time who wanted to look good. Her hair is done. And I give her a lot of credit for that because she was not a well individual. Second reason I like this photograph is because it gives you a glimpse into what this woman might have been, could have been, all the time. Her name was Abby Gardner, and she was that scared little 13-year-old girl sitting on the chair in that cabin as those 9 dangerous-looking men entered the cabin on that terrible, cold winter night. Abby Gardner's story starts about 1,000 miles due east of that little cabin in Spirit Lake, Iowa. She was born in the Twin Lakes area of upper state New York, specifically in Seneca County. Where in Seneca County, we're not exactly sure. Abby's father, Roland Gardner, who was born in 1815 in New Haven, Connecticut, moved here when he was a young man. Although we don't know exactly when Roland Gardner arrived in Seneca County, we do know that he was here on March 22, 1836, because that's the day he married Frances Smith. In the 6 years after they were married, Roland and Frances had 3 daughters, Mary, Eliza, and Abigail, or Abby. The family lived in the beautiful Seneca County area for 14 years. During that time, it appears that Abby's father probably worked in a factory in Seneca Falls making combs. In 1850, the family moved away from Seneca County, southwest about 75 miles to Greenwood, a small town where Roland operated a sawmill. They were there for less than a year, and then they moved about 3.5 miles south to a small hamlet by the name of Rexville, where Roland purchased a sawmill and operated it for about 3 years, till 1853. 2 important things happened during the time the family lived in Rexville. Number 1, Mary, age 16, married Harvey Luce, and the 2 of them left to go live with Harvey's family in Ohio. And second, Roland and Frances had another child, this one Roland Jr., and Abby now had a brother. Abby would later recall that the years she spent in Greenwood and Rexville were the happiest days of her life, walking with her sisters by what she called the rippling waters of the nearby river, climbing the rugged slope to the towering hills, listening to the buzz of the great saw in her father's sawmill, her first days of school, and playing with all the other children around that schoolhouse, going to church with her family, the Methodist church. She was safe, she was secure, and she was happy. And then it all ended for Abby Gardner, that wonderful life that she had in New York. And she found herself on one spring day in 1853 walking alongside a covered wagon that looked something like these wagons, walking away from Rexfield, New York, walking away from all of her friends and family and maternal grandparents, her school, her church, her house, everything she and her family owned that would not fit in that covered wagon. It must have been a shock when Roland told his young family that they were going to leave everything and everybody behind and go to the edge of the American frontier. Abby was only 10 years old at the time. By modern standards, she would be a 4th or 5th grader. Eliza was 11 years old, and little Roland was only 2 years old. The first phase of the trip from Rexville, New York to Davenport, Iowa, would be around 630 miles. And if you assume that they could travel about 15 miles a day, they would be able to make that trip in as little as 43 days if they worked hard at it. It took the Gardner family somewhere between a year and a half to make that part of the trip. It's not exactly clear why it took so long, but there are a number of possibilities. But first, let me tell you where this information comes from. See this book right here? Abby Gardner wrote it. It took her over 25 years to do it, but she published it in 1885 when she was 42 years old, and it was 28 years after the massacre at Spirit Lake. I'll refer to this as Abby's book. And there's another book, this one right here. It was written by Colonel Lorenzo Porter Lee. He spent time with Abby Gardner shortly after her release and was able to have conversations with her about what happened. And he reports those conversations in this book, which was published the very year of the massacre, 1857. I'll refer to this as Colonel Lee's book. Colonel Lee wrote that Abby told him that when they got to Ohio, the Gardner family operated a boarding house for some period of time. In her book, Abby doesn't say anything about that. Abby does write that when they got to Norwalk, Ohio, the family met up with Sister Mary and her husband, Harvey Luce, and their little baby boy, Albert, age 1. They now had 2 wagons and 4 adults and 4 children, 2 of whom were under the age of 2. Abby also says that her father did some grading work for the railroad in Northwest Ohio and Indiana for some period of time. Not sure how long they were there. And from there, they headed to Davenport, Iowa, where they arrived late in 1854, again a year or a year and a half after they started out from Rexville, New York. I tell you all of that to suggest this, that the Gardner family was traveling a lot in the years 1853 over the winter into 1854. They must have sought shelter for the winter somewhere, where, not exactly clear, but clearly they spent a lot of time in that covered wagon. And yet all those years later, when Abby is talking about this trip, she has nothing but good memories. It sounds like she's talking about an episode of Little House on the Prairie. Everything is happiness and fields of waving grain and grassy meadows, beautiful streams, shady woodlands. She even says, quote, "Jolly times we children had," close quote. But we know that's not the way it really was. It turns out that it's not easy to find an original, authentic covered wagon from those days. This one I found in a museum in Minnesota, the Long Lake Pioneer Museum, Long Lake, Minnesota. And it really kind of gives you a perspective of what it must have been like to travel 15 miles a day in a wagon or walking next to a wagon like this. The family eventually reaches Davenport in a covered wagon like this. And I was in Davenport as part of the research I was doing for this story, and I encountered this. And I realized, how is it that people could even live in a covered wagon when it rained like this, maybe for days and days? And you can only draw one conclusion, that it must have been miserable in a covered wagon. Not much room, hot when it's hot out, cold when it's cold out, extremely uncomfortable, a jarring ride to say the least. The experience was not like this. It was more like this. Hailstorms, rainstorms, blazing heat, dysentery, fever, wagon breaks down, horses are sick, kids are sick, mud, mosquitoes, horseflies, always wet when it rains. Everything gets wet. Can't build a fire because you can't find any dry wood. Sleeping in tents or on the ground on blankets. No room in the wagon for sleep. Set up for supper and then repack the wagon every day. Feed the horses. Very few baths. No toilet paper. Leaves or used sticks or even sometimes dirt. The wagons are full, organized at first, and then after a month or two it turns into something like this. You had to walk. There was no room on the wagon. Everything is always dirty. Why was Abby's version of that trip so inconsistent with what we know it would have been like? You'd have to ask a psychologist or psychiatrist, I guess, but I suspect it had something to do with the post-traumatic stress disorder. Everything before the massacre was good, and everything after was bad. And by the way, why did Roland Gardner decide to move his family from the safety and comfort of New York to the extreme frontier of Iowa? Abby later wrote that he was chasing the setting sun like a boy in pursuit of a rainbow and the hope of finding a pot of gold just beyond. We're going to leave the Gardner family in their covered wagon in Davenport for right now. We'll be back to them in a few chapters.